Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the July American Cetacean Society San Francisco Bay monthly speaker event, the fourth Tuesday of the month. I'm Susan Hopp, a board member, and I'm here with fellow board member Gail Koza. And for anyone new to the American Cetacean Society, ACS began in 1967 and is the oldest nonprofit dedicated to the protection of whales, dolphins, porpoises, and their habitat. And we do this through education, community engagement, and grants toward marine research. And regarding our grants, we are now accepting grant applications through a link on our website. So we're excited about that. And we so appreciate your donations in support of our mission. They help fund our grants and support our expenses around these monthly talks. So to all of you who donate, a very big thank you. We are recording this session and we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A, and after the presentation, we will do our best to get to them. Tonight, we are crossing the Pacific, but connecting the dots to what makes for healthy ocean habitat, with a spotlight on something that few of us, I think, actually think much about: mangroves. And coincidentally and most fittingly, today is International Day for the Conservation of Mangrove Ecosystems. Tonight's talk is Ecosystem Restoration from Roots to Reefs: What's Happening and Why It's Essential for Ocean Health. I am really thrilled to introduce Dr. Gretchen Coffman. And although one of our own San Franciscans, she's currently based in Singapore, where I believe it is Wednesday morning around 10 a.m. So let me tell you a little bit about Gretchen. Dr. Coffman is an environmental scientist and wetland restoration ecologist whose work focuses on the connection of riparian, wetlands, coastal, and ocean ecology. Her teaching and research span home bases in San Francisco and Singapore, where she has ongoing research projects along rivers and watersheds in coastal Southern California, the San Francisco Bay Area, the Central Valley of California, and throughout Southeast Asia. She's currently a senior lecturer at the National University of Singapore in the Department of Geography, Tropical Environmental Change Research Group. She's also involved with the United Nations Decade of Ecosystem Restoration and the 30 by 30 initiative, calling for 30% of the planet to be protected and managed for nature by 2030. So Gretchen, good morning, and thank you so much for being here and sharing your work and knowledge with us.
Thank you so much, Susan. Great to see you in my hometown of San Francisco, virtually here from Wednesday morning in Singapore. I am delighted to be with the American Cetacean Society and talking to you guys about habitat, right? That was the last thing that you work on protecting, but you wouldn't think that you would protect mangrove habitat, like this mangrove ecosystem or forest back here in Borneo that I can't get to now because of the pandemic. Haven't been there since the summer of 2019. So I'm going to talk to you virtually about what's going on in these coastal communities, especially in light of the pandemic, and why are they so important to cetaceans and other marine megafauna. So I'm going to make that link and mostly talk to you all about ecosystem restoration, which is the focus of my research and the reason I came to work at NUS in the geography department. So let me share my screen and we'll get started. All right, so here is a photograph. I didn't take this, I wish I did, of coral reefs underwater, connecting to mangroves and their roots. So that's what I'm going to discuss today, that incredibly important connection. And I can't wait to get back in the field in Borneo and Indonesia so I can study that connection. All right, so right now what we're doing is virtual field trips and virtual tours of restoration sites. And my students have been helping to facilitate restoration virtually. But let's talk about why these mangrove ecosystems are so important. But first up, I just wanted to say that my teaching philosophy and practice revolves around discovery and exploration because I'm a field ecologist. And like Susan said in the introduction, she was so generous in talking about myself, so I can go quickly through these slides, but I'm a wetland restoration ecologist and mangroves are wetlands. But I've now converted from an environmental science department at the University of San Francisco, where I taught for 11 years, to a conservation biogeographer, weaving in community-based coastal restoration, like in mangrove ecosystems. And so the biggest challenge, though, here in this part of the world where the pandemic is still raging all around us in Southeast Asia, is that I wasn't able to teach in the field easily. But we were able to get out and go kayaking with my colleague in the middle here, Dan Fries, who is the mangrove expert of Southeast Asia. So we work closely together. And my PhD student, we took 40 students from the Bachelor's of Environmental Studies program out into the mangroves on kayaks. So I work in experiential learning. And so I'm going to take you on a journey, although virtual, through what I think is one of the most important ecosystems in the world, to the oceans. And we don't think about very often. All right, and I just wanted to point out that this is a wildlife camera photo that was taken of the smooth coated otters. The closest to what I've seen is a cetacean. Obviously it's not a cetacean, but the smooth coated otters are coming back and taking over Singapore during the pandemic. So we've set out a bunch of camera traps, done virtual trainings with my students, and then gotten into the field in very small groups. And that's about the extent of what we can do here in Singapore. We're not allowed to travel. And the way I got involved in a meaningful way in oceans is through being an open water swimmer, rower, and through the International Ocean Film Festival. And I see that our director, Ana Blanco, is on this webinar today. So hi, Ana, just a shout out to the amazing festival and review committee that I've been part of for almost 15 years now. We had a successful virtual film festival again in 2021, and trying to bring the festival here to Singapore and students to learn about the importance of oceans. Even though we're surrounded by oceans here in Singapore, and I'll show you a map in a moment since I'm a biogeographer, we aren't as close to the oceans as we are where I grew up in Georgia. This is St. Simon's Island, Georgia, and I had to include a cetacean. This is a bottlenose dolphin that's swimming at high tide in the salt marshes where we kayak in the summers. Well, used to. I can't get back to Georgia right now, but we used to. So I went from the salt marshes of my childhood to the mangroves of Southeast Asia, and I'm going to explain my journey in a moment. So I wanted to say again, happy International Mangrove Ecosystem Day. This is a UNESCO, an important UNESCO day. Mangroves are rare, spectacular ecosystems on the boundary between land and sea. And so we celebrate this day. It's actually July 26th. We celebrate the whole week because you can't always get together on a Monday or a Tuesday. And it's in support of the Love 3030, 30% of the oceans being protected, including mangrove ecosystems by 2030. And so this also connects to the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, which is 2021, just started in June, to 2030. As well as the UN Ocean Decade. So it's all coming together. And so this is a great celebration of mangroves and their connection to oceans and restoration of these vital ecosystems. And this ecosystem restoration call is a call to action in the next 10 years. If we don't do it right in the next 10 years, and I've been involved for 30 years of my career doing this, we haven't been doing it right. So today I'm going to suggest, from my insight in the last 30 plus years, what we should be doing in this 10 years to get it right and to start combating climate change and the effects of climate change, especially in vulnerable areas like coastal communities and tropical areas around the world in what we now call the global South. All right, so let me take you to Southeast Asia from San Francisco way over here. I made this journey in August to start working at the National University of Singapore. And why was that? I went all the way over here around this way, actually not this way, to Southeast Asia. And here's the little red dot. Yes, we are called the little red dot because we're just a red dot on a map. That's Singapore, at the tip of Malaysia. The reason for coming to Singapore was because there's an incredible biodiversity in Southeast Asia. It's a hotspot of all the biodiversity of coral reefs and mangroves and terrestrial ecosystems in this tropical belt around the world. In the Coral Triangle, it's immense. It includes 6 countries over here on the left, including Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and all these other countries. And it's 6 million kilometers squared. It's this enormous area. However, surrounded by, all these islands are surrounded by oceans and have almost 80% of the world's coral species found in this area. And the Coral Triangle has more coral reef fish diversity than anywhere else in the world and contains 37% of the world's fish species. 6 of the 7 of our world's amazing marine turtle species live in the coral reefs connected to the mangrove ecosystems, as well as all these cetaceans down here and other marine megafauna like rays and sharks, and is a nursery for all the fish in the food web that supports this vital ecosystem. All right, so here is a zoom in of the Coral Triangle. We're here in Singapore right here, but what I wanted to point out in this illustration is that coral reefs are in blue, and so they're dotted along the coastlines of the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, and Solomon Islands. These 6 countries that are in the scientific boundary of the Coral Triangle in brown. There's an expansive boundary that's in dark blue that includes Singapore as well. And this is, in policy terms, an area that they're also protecting as well around this hotspot of biodiversity. And I want to point out that we don't just have coral reefs in blue, but we have mangroves in green. And these are just a little bit inland, but are still intertidal ecosystems where the tides are connected and rise and fall each day. And then finally wanted to point out marine protected areas with dots here, these small areas in the Philippines and dotted throughout the Coral Triangle, but the larger areas in hatching. And this hatching area is only in a couple of areas here in Malaysia, in between Indonesia and Timor-Leste. And this is what we're trying to do globally with the 30-30 initiative, trying to increase this 3% of protection to 30% of protection, both in mangrove ecosystems as well as coral reefs because of their important connection. So let's start off with what are mangroves. Many of you might know what mangroves are, but let me just go run through what they are and why they're important. So they're forested wetland ecosystems. And wetland ecosystems, again, are areas that are vegetated with either trees or, in the San Francisco Bay Area, pickleweed and saltgrass and cordgrass that we see lining the San Francisco Bay. And these are wetland ecosystems in which the plants have to adapt to tidal inundation and desiccation. So these areas are really important, both in the San Francisco Bay Area and temperate climates, and are analogous to mangrove ecosystems. The only reason we have trees here in the tropics is we get so much more rainfall in the tropics to support these larger types of vegetation. So they're found in saltwater. However, there are freshwater rivers and estuaries that feed into these saltwater ecosystems along these tropical coastlines around the equator. So why I think and have studied mangroves for so long is that they have these really cool adaptations to the rise and fall of the tides. And this is low tide in Borneo, in Sabah, Malaysian Borneo, where I work. And this image just shows the silt and prop roots, this really enormous root that is propping up the Rhizophora apiculata, or red mangroves here in this soggy hydric soils that they grow in. And not only do they support these huge biomasses, but they also have little lenticles along these roots that actually support gas exchange. So they're like little snorkels that help the trees to respire and then photosynthesize. So they keep their green leaves above the water. So they prop them up so that the green leaves can photosynthesize as well. So these are mangrove forests at low tide. And at low tide, we see really cool little fish called mud skippers that hop around and jump around and leap around to show off and mate. And so sometimes the mudflats look alive at low tide, but at high tide, these prop roots, or also called aerial roots, are really important in gas exchange so that these plants can access, and their roots can access, oxygen. All right, so the other really cool thing about mangroves is they have propagals, not just seeds. These are live plants that grow on these trees and shrubs on the mangroves. And why do they do this? Because they have to grow in this inhospitable environment. High tide, where they're waterlogged and there's no oxygen, to the low tide, where there's desiccation and very little water to support the growth of these plants. So what do these little propagals do? Well, they drop off when they're ready. They float around in the salt water or brackish water, and they find a little place to propagate, to spear down into, like a torpedo, into the sediment and start growing and growing these little leaves. So these are little seedlings at high tide after they have torpedoed into the sediment. So why mangroves, you might ask? It's really hard to work in these areas. It's dangerous to dive and snorkel, although that's what I aspire to do more of when we can get to these areas, to understand the connection and their importance to the open ocean and coral reefs. But also it's hard at low tide because the mud is like quicksand. So why do we study these? Well, for a multitude of ecosystem services that the mangrove ecosystems support. And the first thing you notice on this wonderful infographic, is that there are animals, langurs, macaques, all sorts of birds, and slow-loris and mammals and primates that live up in the canopy of these mangroves. Even the proboscis monkey in Borneo I've seen. And then underneath the water, it's a nursery for small sharks and rays and crabs and invertebrates and fish. And here's our little mud skipper here. But it's also incredibly important for regulation of our climate, coastal protection against tsunamis and typhoons and hurricanes, supports water quality through filtration of pollutants and nutrients, is a sustainable resource if the local communities understand and are educated about how to use it sustainably, and is a biodiverse area for habitat for these wildlife and nurseries to fish, birds, and invertebrates, connecting to coral reefs in the open ocean. So if you love to dive or you love cetaceans, then you have to love mangroves too, because these are ultimately the nurseries for everything that we want to see on our dives and support sustainably based ecotourism. So one thing that's the big buzzword now is blue carbon. And since I'm a scientist, I just wanted to show a couple of quick slides that support the reason these ecosystems are so important. So this figure, this graph shows a number of different ecosystems and tropical climates, as well as temperate climates up here, salt marshes and seagrasses. And then in the temperate regions of the world, we have mangrove ecosystems and tropical rainforests. And what I want to show you is where the blue carbon has a much higher potential to sequester carbon if it's natural and functioning well. And so over here in the legend, we see green and brown. Well, in green, that is the leaves, the above ground biomass, and in brown, that's the soil carbon. And as you can see by the x-axis, we increase in total carbon that can be sequestered. Carbon equivalent is the unit here. And we peak at oceanic mangrove ecosystems around islands, such as in throughout Southeast Asia. And then we also have much higher in estuaries around the world. But I just wanted to show that there's this huge amount of storage in the blue carbon in Southeast Asia. Well, why else should we protect these ecosystems and restore them? Well, in this paper, we can just zoom into Southeast Asia over here, but we can also see in North America and South America that coastal mangroves are where they're black lines, all dotting the coasts of these tropical areas of these continents and islands. But there are cyclone, typhoon, and hurricane paths. Those are all the same, just in different locations around the world. And these areas are protected by tsunamis, hurricanes, and typhoons by these mangroves. They act as sponges during these huge events that are getting even more extreme during climate change or climate chaos that's happening now in the world that we're seeing every year. And so this is just a picture. I don't think anyone can forget, if you're my age or even a little bit younger or older, January 2005, the devastation after the 2004 tsunami in Southeast Asia. And this is a picture of Thailand, where there used to be, and there's still a couple of mangrove trees over here, but basically these communities were wiped out because around Southeast Asia, because the not ecotourism, but the tourism and the resorts had actually, and the communities had crept up so closely that they had destroyed the mangrove ecosystems. And I believe these were all created or converted into shrimp ponds and fish ponds. And so you can see all these communities adjacent were devastated. So mangroves act as buffers in these extreme events. So let's get to the connection with what we're talking about today. These marine megafauna, including cetaceans. Well, you'd be surprised, but dugongs and manatees have 80% of their species group uses mangrove ecosystems and other coastal wetlands. And in temperate regions, the manatees will use the salt marshes for habitat and refuge, because they need to have specific temperatures in areas that they are safe from predators. But we also have dolphins and porpoises, sea turtles, crocodiles, alligators, otters, like I mentioned earlier in Singapore, as well as sharks and rays, using a significant amount of their species group using mangroves and coastal ecosystems. I just want to show a quick video clip from Indonesia, where I work. showing the amazing, this is just snorkeling with the batfish and cardinal fish that were nowhere to be seen in the adjacent coral reefs. They were only found in this one lone mangrove. And so I'm excited to start snorkeling and scuba diving in areas that that I can get to. I'm going diving on Saturday here in Singapore, and I look forward to diving more in mangroves to look at the connection. Now you know why they're important, but the sad news is that there are many endangered species that need these mangrove ecosystems for their habitats, and they are endangered, in fact, because of coastal development and impacts. So this is a graph made by a student of Dan Fries that I showed you earlier, who studies mangroves, and they studied mangroves throughout Southeast Asia. And this is in 2012, the dominant land use that caused the deforestation of mangroves throughout Southeast Asia. And as you can see up in Myanmar, it's rice cultivation, oil palm plantations in Sumatra, and blue dots all over the place, aquaculture. So that's fish ponds and shrimp. And you'd be surprised to know that most of our shrimp in the Bay Area and around the US comes from Southeast Asia and these shrimp ponds. So I gave up shrimp a long time ago. So this is what they look like when mangrove ecosystems or mangrove forests are converted to shrimp farms. They don't last very long because of they're unsustainable when they're at a large scale like this. And they only last a few years. So there's a huge effort in Thailand by Mangrove Action Project to restore these areas back to mangrove ecosystems. But you can imagine how difficult it is when they've been converted to these open water habitats. And they've also been converted to rice paddies all over Southeast Asia. And you have to understand this because people live in these coastal communities off of rice and fish. Okay, going down to the seagrass, a little bit lower in the intertidal zone. The locals here in Lombok and throughout Southeast Asia forage for invertebrates here in this woman's bag, all sorts of invertebrates that they eat for dinner each day. And so when they over forage in these marine protected areas, that's a problem. They also trample the seagrass beds. And so we're trying to help enforce through the community protection of these areas that are actually in a marine protected area and give the local specific areas where they can forage. All right, and so then getting down into the coral reefs and open ocean, what's happening there? What are the unsustainable fishing practices? Well, there's overfishing, there's unsustainable fishing practices like long lining and gill nets and just huge nets that will trawl along the bottom and collect everything in its pathway, to the most devastating are fish bombing, which either kills the fish and you can then sell the fish in the fish market up here in this photograph up here, or they're collected for the live fish trade. And this is devastating coral reefs around Malaysia and Indonesia where I work, just leaving these huge scars that really don't restore themselves because it's just like a mine site, really. So these are the impacts. But now I want to go back to, well, why mangroves and why do we need them? Why are they connected to coral? How are they connected to seagrass beds and coral reefs? And then I want to focus the second half of the talk on what can we do. I like to take action as a wetland restoration ecologist and someone that works with communities. So in the first panel up here, this is where mangroves are present. We have mangrove ecosystems that are hopefully either pristine or at least functioning, have many ecosystem services and function naturally. And as you can see, they are species diverse and they have lots of abundance of fish species that are also found in the older coral reefs that we want to see, these large fish and diversity of fish, but there's these ecosystems in between. So they start off as a nursery and they go back and forth between the seagrass beds where they forage and back to habitat and protection in the roots of the mangrove forest. And then they start, as they grow older, they start to go into the shallow reefs where they're a little bit more protected, and then out into the larger, older reefs and the open ocean. And this includes sharks and rays and other species as well. This is a simplified cartoon diagram. And then in the bottom, this is where they're absent. So maybe if we're lucky, we still have some seagrass beds, but they're probably pretty degraded, but we don't have mangroves. And what happens, there's not a lot of habitat for them to actually hide in and forage. So they're susceptible to fishing and predators, and that decreases their populations, and only the hardiest species will survive, just a couple of species. And so that effect is seen throughout these ecosystems all the way to the largest coral reefs where we want to see these when we're diving. So a recent study that just came out in 2020 is one of the first that I've seen, is that shows that human proximity to mangroves is associated with odor cues. And I just wanted to point out that mangrove leaf litter, this is such a cool study, is a predictable cue to coastal habitat. So chemical information from mangrove leaves, they predicted or hypothesized could provide a source of settlement cues for coastal fish, drawing larvae of these fish, where the coastal fishes will lay their larvae towards shallow benthic habitats and inducing settlement in these mangrove ecosystems and seagrass ecosystems. And so they did experiments with juvenile fish in the lab, as well as looking in the field, and field experiments from the Caribbean and Fiji in the Indo-Pacific. And they found that they were attracted to cues from mangrove leaves. So they just placed mangrove leaves in areas where, in coral reef areas, and mangrove in areas where there were no mangrove leaves, to see what the recruitment would be. And so they found a higher amount of recruitment in areas with mangrove leaves in coral reefs. So everyone loses if we don't protect and restore mangroves. These coastal communities are particularly vulnerable because they lose out on their social cohesion, security, especially in times of pandemics, their health, as well as ecosystem health, and their basic material life, like fish that they fish for sustainably in these ecosystems. So they lose their sustainable livelihood and shift to poaching, which we're seeing during the pandemic, both on land and in the sea. So to end on the negative and start on the positive, these are some ecosystem impacts and resilience. So the question I was asking myself in March of 2020, when I was in San Francisco in our shelter in place lockdown, what are the impacts to these three ecosystems? And is there any resilience in these coastal communities during the pandemic? Well, it turns out there were multiple large threats even before the pandemic in places like Indonesia that led to a really bad situation during the pandemic. So there was an earthquake in 2018, a drought in 2019, and the pandemic starting in 2020 that was affecting the coastal sustainability of these communities and pushing the communities to start poaching, to put food on the table for their families. There was then, in the pandemic, a lack of tourism, almost no tourism at first, and now just a small trickle of tourists that are going to stay for a long time and actually try to work and help these communities to just survive in the pandemic. So what happened is these guys in the picture here started going back to fishing and farming, but in unsustainable ways. And they're going for fish like sharks and rays because they bring in, and they're the shark fins because they bring in more money. So we're seeing more of these fins and larger megafauna in the markets in Indonesia right now during the pandemic because of the lack of resilience throughout the region. Now, what's on a positive note, it turns out our collaborator says that there's more resilience in Lombok than in neighboring Bali to the west because Bali overdeveloped their tourism, whereas Lombok has only developed a little bit in the Gili Islands, and in the areas we're working in the secret Gili Islands and around the rest of Bali, it's still, these communities are still doing what they did for millennia. And they're fishing coastal fish, the coastal fish, but trying to do it sustainably. And then on another positive note, the rice prices have dropped because it's a wet year. And so they got 2 rice crops in instead of 1. And so they're eating a lot more rice and going back to the fishing in Lombok. So that's the positive note for Lombok. But unfortunately, I'm in contact with folks in the eco and tourism industry in Bali, and they are really suffering. 80% of their income comes from tourism. So that brings me to the concept of resilience and ecosystem restoration. That's what I'm really focusing my research on. And there are many different definitions of resilience, and it's really this buzzwords that I try to stay away from, but my student, Jonathan Wren, just couldn't stay away from it. So I said, okay, let's delve into resilience and ecosystem restoration, which is actually where it has its origins. And this is my favorite definition. Having the capacity to bend or break, to return to an original shape or condition. So like these mangrove branches or roots, we become resilient if we can actually survive all of these impacts that we've had in Southeast Asia, including the pandemic, in a novel, and this requires novel ways of thinking and novel approaches. So what I'm going to propose today, and what I've been thinking a lot about and starting to write about, are restoration challenges. So I'm a wetland restoration ecologist, have been doing that for 30 plus years, but we haven't been getting it right. And that's why we're in the UN decade of ecosystem restoration. We've been doing tree planting, and there's big efforts now doing tree planting, but they're not planting the right species in the right places, even if they're doing large scale landscape restoration. So let's think about creating resilient ecosystems through novel restoration approaches. And there are 4 main restoration challenges that I came up with in addressing innovative approaches to creating resilient ecosystems. And I'm going to go through these in my Roots to Reefs example in the remainder of my time today with you. Number 1, restoration was usually funded by and performed by governments and private companies that would be funded by these governments, as well as not large NGOs like the Nature Conservancy. That's all well and good, but we weren't getting it right because we weren't thinking about the community and getting the surrounding communities, wherever you are in the world, involved in meaningful ways as stakeholders, and engaging them throughout the whole process, from the planning to the planting to the monitoring, and the protection of the marine protected areas, I'm going to argue, is essential to building ecosystem resilience. Number 2, we weren't accountable. Trees were dying after a minimal 5 years in the US of the funded monitoring. And if it was an NGO, they wouldn't even be accountable sometimes throughout the US because the funding was not linked to mitigation, which is restoration of impacts to wetlands in the US, so to the Clean Water Act. that was linked to the Clean Water Act. Well, we don't have policies and laws like that throughout the tropics. So we need to think about this in a different way. And we need to focus on simple, implementable monitoring plans that communities can take part in. So measuring growth of trees, measuring survivorship, simple things. And I'm going to propose simple strategies that we can use to connect communities. And that leads to funding these communities so that they have a sustainable livelihood that is not overfishing and unsustainable fishing and poaching. Now, number 3, small sites. We focused on small sites because we had limited funding and they could, and we had limited effort and resources. So we need to scale up to larger landscape approach and come up with creative sources of funding, unique, diversified, and sustainable sources. Our sources were usually less than 2 years because grants were less than 2 years, and at best 5 years because of mitigation projects that were required to monitor for 5 years. I think if it's a tree or forested ecosystem, we should at least be monitoring for 10 to 20 years when the trees start to mature. So let me go over, and this is the fun part of the talk, the roots to reefs example that Susan mentioned earlier, and a resilient approach to ecosystem restoration, integrating people, landscape, restoration, monitoring, and sustainable funding, all weaved into these mangrove roots. Well, here's an area that the fishermen in Lombok have removed because this is where they actually can see the little fires. I'm going to tell a very quick story here. These little fires here, those were mangroves. They cut the mangroves down and built fires because the fish that they predominantly catch now go off really quickly. So they have to boil water and boil these fish immediately when they get off the boats. So they cut down a lot of mangrove trees for that reason. So we need to connect with these communities to understand and educate them that they can bring other trees with them, put them next to their boats, and then they don't have to cut down the mangrove trees. So we have to get them to embrace mangroves, the importance of mangroves, and how to live sustainably with them in order to have resilient ecosystems. And all of these different steps that I just mentioned, from the planning and permitting process with the headmen in the villages, to the seed collection, nursery propagation, planting, monitoring for survival growth, and the ecosystem, the soils and the water that flows throughout this, and the water quality, as well as doing education to the youth and the other parts of the villages. So in Roots to Reefs, that David McGuire and I of Shark Stewards started brainstorming about 2013 in Cambodia, where we were trying to start a project like this. We then finally went to Borneo and then finally ended up in Lombok here in the Coral Triangle with an organization I'm going to tell you about in a moment called Source. And we're looking at not just the connection between mangrove, seagrass, and coral reef, but doing restoration of each of these and understanding how the restoration trajectory is going to change. And these ecosystems are going to hopefully grow and become more resilient over time. And this is just one pilot study here in Lombok in the Lesser Sunda seascape of the larger Coral Triangle. So let me zoom into the Seketong Peninsula here, just south of the Gili Islands, where some of you might have been or want to go diving. But it's even more incredible down here on this little peninsula I'm going to take you to in a moment, because we were the first, our organization was the first to come in and do real sustainable ecotourism. And when you get there first, you can do a lot more good than when you get there last. So we're in the secret Gili Islands. Does this intrigue you at all? This is a little bit of haze or fog in the morning as sun rises. And it's a beautiful area of Lombok, which has only a few resorts and is mostly protected by a new marine protected area. So we have this whole area right here, which has active marine protection in turquoise, but you can also see the coral reefs that are dotting the coast in yellow, and the mangroves in orange up here on the northern coast of the peninsula, as well as some seagrasses that are a little bit harder to see. But all three of these ecosystems are then being protected by the new Gita Nada National Marine Park, which goes from the tip of the peninsula, where you can go surfing, by the way, if Izzy's on this webinar, all the way to almost to Macharam, which is right up here, the main city. And the most incredible area down here, you can also dive. It extends, the sustainable fisheries zone extends down here to where you can see schooling hammerheads, multiple species of schooling hammerheads. All right, so welcome to SOARS. We connected with SOARS and Cara Majerus, who's the director, 6 or 7 years ago on Pom Pom Island in Borneo, where David and I have been working for many years. And this area was really difficult to get to for eco-tourists, but also impossible for students because of the piracy that was happening between the Philippines and Sabah, Malaysian Borneo. So we had to go in search of a different, safer location. And Cara Majaris brought her 5 kids and her husband and one of her best friends to this location to set up SOURCE in 2019, the Sustainable Oceanic Research, Conservation, and Education nonprofit, or what they call a charity in the UK. They have a local organization, nonprofit as well. So here we are at the SOURCE field station over here to the right on the peninsula, near the Bataputi village, and the main community is right here. And so I just wanted to zoom in to the mangroves that are in between the field station and the community. And this is our restoration plan, the first element of our virtual helping of SOURCE during the pandemic in their restoration, ecosystem restoration projects called Roots to Reefs. So my graduate student, amazing, she's from Indonesia as well, from Borneo, and she online from Borneo, because she couldn't get to Singapore, made these incredible maps. And the other 3 students helped in the restoration plan. If anyone's interested, I can share that in the chat. But this is an incredible plan that we did last fall in fall 2020, while we were all stuck inside on our computers. So this area right here, all these colors are the Roots to Reefs mangrove project area in Lombok. And the orange and red areas are the 3 mangrove restoration sites. The greenish and blue are the seagrass restoration sites, and the coral reefs are in this hot pink. Okay, so these are the areas that we had to, and luckily we went to in 2019 before we all got shut down through the pandemic, but our partners are working with the community to look at the reefs and the seagrass to figure out suitability for restoration. So this is the first pilot study area, and the trees right here are color coded in flags so that the locals and the volunteers know which ones are which species and where to plant them. So let's talk about real ecosystem mangrove restoration. So this is, we always start with a model. This is what we want our restoration site to look like. This is in Borneo where I work. And this is where eco-tourists want to kayak into. They don't want to kayak into an area that's been cut down by the local community. So this can draw in eco-tourists, and the community in turn can get paid to help plant. And this is a great way of educating locals as well. So we start with the planting, and then we head to the collection of the mangrove propagules, which are live plants already. They don't, some of these have been floating for a while, so they already have cotyledons, or two little leaves, but these are live plants, so it's really easy to plant these in. These are all red mangroves, 3 different red mangrove species, and they're incredibly abundant. So these can be planted directly into the mangrove restoration site or into pots. We've been planting them into pots. Of course, I'm planting virtually, but our collaborators at SOURCE have built a nursery with the community, and the community is getting paid for all of this through a couple of novel funding opportunities. And they're planting about 1,500 trees per month, which is a lot. It's hard to find enough propagills for that. They have about 8 different species that they've been able to propagate so far, and we're doing experiments to try to propagate. There's probably about 20, 25 species in the mangrove ecosystem. And the area that's been most devastated is the landward ecosystem area, and there are not enough propagills in that area. So they're going far and wide to find those unique species to plant them to increase ecosystem resilience. And so here's just a zoom in of some students planting in Thailand through the MAP, Mangrove Action Project Network, in a community-based mangrove restoration project. So this is what we hope to do in November when the rainy season comes around. We need to wait to the rainy season so that the mangroves can grow, and they only grow well through fresh water. And so we're actually watering them in the nursery with fresh water. So the second challenge is monitoring. So getting the project right. So in order to monitor long-term and to understand what is working well and what is working not so well, and informing future management of this area, but also other areas, we've implemented a citizen science monitoring project in Borneo. Here are some of my students working with the locals. They're monitoring soil moisture and hydrology. Here, they're also monitoring soil pH and vegetation, as well as survivorship and growth of trees. We don't need these fancy pieces of equipment, although they're not that expensive. So we can train the locals, and they get really excited about using the guitar that's also known as a soil moisture meter. So I propose getting the community involved in a meaningful way in monitoring success or the pitfalls of this type of restoration, so we can change the trajectory and create sustainable, resilient mangrove ecosystems that are restored. All right, third is to scale up into the landscape approach. And we haven't done this yet, we're just in the planning stages, but my students have done some GIS analysis and found that in this little location, we can expand from the Roots to Reefs project. These areas in yellow are all areas that were cut down by locals. Luckily, they're now protected by the marine protected area. However, it's not enforced. And that's where the communities come in the enforcement of these areas. All right, and this is the suitability study that one of my other Indonesian students conducted, showing source right here, our field station, the community, and then our project area, Roots to Reefs right here, that it's yellow or suitable for restoration. And we don't need this to know if I'm on the ground, but this is a great exercise to educate our students, to show them the process of science and understanding how to use spatial analysis to go out into a landscape perspective. We were only looking on the ground at the project area, but there are all these other areas that are suitable for mangrove restoration in the region that we can plan to go to if our project is successful in the next couple of years. Well, we need funding to do this. To achieve these first 3 approaches to restoration, we need to secure diversified and novel funding. Funding is always the biggest issue. So what I want to just end on here is 3 novel and sustainable ways. One of them, at least, is a sustainable way of funding these community-based restoration projects in mangroves and in the other ecosystems. But the reason mangroves are such a hot item to restore now is because blue carbon is the buzz phrase as well, and it links to climate change and helping communities to become more resilient in the face of climate change and the pandemic, as well as planting trees, because it's fun to plant trees. So there's an app called the treeapp.org, and they approached Cara, the director, and I'm their scientific advisor, and we went through a process of vetting a Roots to Reefs and Sources program And they were approved in May, and they are starting to grow 1,500 trees per month in their nursery, and we'll start planting them out into the project area in November. This will pay for 2 community members to keep the nursery, collect propagules and seeds, lead community-based planting events, and with volunteers and eco-tourists when they can come again, as well as students, and monitor tree survival and growth. So how does it work? Well, over here on the right, we can't unfortunately get the app, so I just have to explain from their website how you can do it when we can. This is a UK-based organization that's trying to go global. So the more we promote it, the more likely they're going to become global. They have a dozen field sites throughout the tropics that they're planting, that they're working with community-based programs like ours to plant trees. So they're sponsoring those. So you pick one of these projects in step 1 and step 2. You listen to a short advertisement from a sustainable company like Patagonia, for example, for those of you from California. And then that helps to plant 1 tree a day. And if you tell your friends and family and you post it on social media, it will build exponentially. And then you're able to actually understand and track the impact on your global footprint, carbon footprint. And then that inspires you hopefully to want to plant more trees, either through watching these videos and learning about more B corporations, sustainable corporations that Susan works with, or wanting to fund this organization to plant more trees, or maybe getting into the field like I do with my students in Singapore locally and planting trees. So the second sustainable type of funding, which is not sustainable right now, is ecotourism. So I just wanted to have a shout out to visit places like Source. So what is responsible travel or sustainable ecotourism or nature-based ecotourism? There are all these different terms. Well, the way I see it is you want to have 3 things going on. You want to support the local economy. You want to connect with the culture of the society that you're working for in meaningful ways, working hand in hand in restoration projects to help support the environment, mangrove restoration in this case, as well as coral reef and seagrass beds. So we need to do these things because, well, we want to do these things because we want to visit places. At least I want to travel again and dive, but I also want to support local economies, support their conservation efforts in a meaningful way, both by our conservation dollars that go to Source and other ecotourism places, but also by supporting their economy while we are there eating and working with the locals. And then to actually get active and work on mangrove restoration, coral reef restoration. You don't have to be a diver to do this. All you have to be interested in doing turtle surveys, walking the beaches, loving beaches, working in the mangrove nursery, doing education events with the communities. So you can do a number of different things with the community to get involved in what we call citizen science, or now the PC term is community science or community-based science. You can learn about Bahasa, the Indonesian language, or the local ethnic group, Sasak. And then you can live in a comfortable, authentic bungalow, and I'm going to show you, end on a couple of pictures of this, eat delicious meals together, and work and live together with amazing volunteerism community here, and just learn a lot and have a lot of fun. So here at Source, this was built in 2019, these amazing, authentic bungalows with Lombok architecture. They all have different little tufts at the top. One has 1, this one has 2, one has 3. You never know how they're going to be built. They all have character, and they're going to be about 20 of these as soon as the pandemic allows for this. Right now, I think there are 5 or 6 of them. All right, and so here's our community living area that was built sustainably with local palm trees that had died or were about to die, and local trees and wood, and with local labor. Why do we do this? Because we want to support the local coastal communities, especially during the pandemic and in the climate chaos. These are the buildings that the locals live in, where we worked in Borneo. and Malaysia, and they look similar in Lombok, although not on stilts, which this is certainly the best way to live when you're close to the coast. So that's why these are on stilts. They're stilted. We worked with the locals, Sourced to design, as well as, I mean, they really were instrumental in designing and finding the building materials that were sustainable. So bamboo and local grasses and trees, and they didn't cut down trees. These are all trees that were already fallen. And then community-based mangrove ecosystem restoration, just a couple of quick photographs from our virtual tree planting on Saturday to celebrate International Mangrove Ecosystem Day. And they bring what they call sludge or mud, you might know it as, but this is the quicksand, or what we call as scientists hydric soil, from the mangrove ecosystems, and they plant in these little poly bags because they're cheaper than pots here. And then they grow them for about 6 months or up to 6 months, and then plant them in the rainy season when they have a better chance of surviving. Well, you can also dive in and work on coral restoration as well too. This is a coral reef tree that I was planting, one of the first trees. They now have 12 trees. And what happens is fragments of coral that are broken off from storm events or boat damage, we collect those, we put them on fishing lines on trees. They grow really quickly, and then they're planted out down here in the coral reefs. It's pretty amazing how quickly these grow. We then assess them, the coral diversity and the fish species that come back after restoration. And we all do this, all the dives on this neat little Indonesian boat. And just to end on the community, because that's what I started on, we do beach cleans with the community to clean up plastic. Plastic pollution is a huge part of the environmental issue in this part of the world. So we want to educate the youth to understand to not use as much plastic, reuse it and recycle it, as well as collect it on these fun beach cleanups, which incorporates games afterwards for the youth. So I'm just going to end on a little video by Source. So in celebration of International Mangrove Ecosystem Day, you can see me right here with 20 of my students. We planted mangrove trees virtually, and I donated for every student in our department and the Bachelor's of Environmental Studies program that I'm the assistant director of. I planted a tree for each of these students and faculty to support communities like this and build sustainable livelihoods and resilient mangrove, seagrass, and coral ecosystems during these challenging times of the pandemic. So there are ways to, you can just take a screenshot of this and we can post it in the chat. But this is Source, both Facebook, follow them on Facebook and Instagram if you want to visit someday. as well as you could just donate $1.40 to plant one tree. And when I get back there, I'll take a picture of that one tree for you. Hopefully I'm going to get back there this summer, but this is one of the novel ways in which hopefully these communities can be funded and we can create resilient ecosystems like these mangroves here in Borneo. Terima kasih, which means thank you. And does anyone have any questions?
I'd like to know when Source starts taking reservations.
They already are, actually. They have, shocking, on Saturday, I found out they have 5 volunteers. It is possible, but the problem is you have to stay like at least 1 month or 2 months because you have to get a work permit. That's the only way to get there now.
Anyway.
But yeah, I know, it's really a tough time.
So
Should I stop sharing my screen? Susan?
It's totally up to you. I think it's great to leave the links up in case people want to write those down. I'll read some of the questions that have come in. We've got a few. The first question for you, Gretchen, is about the red mangrove species. Is it a cosmopolitan species or is it really considered a species complex?
Interesting question. Yes, red mangroves. The reason I say that is for people that don't know the scientific names that aren't botanists. And so there are many species of red mangroves. And let me just back up because mangroves are not just a tree. And I should have probably said this in the very beginning. Mangroves are ecosystems. So it's a mangrove forest or mangrove ecosystem, which I talked about throughout this lecture. But a lot of people just think it's one species, and they're usually thinking of the red mangrove species, or Rhizophora apiculata is the most common. And the problem with most of these mangrove restoration projects, this is a great question. Thank you so much for whomever asked this, that I should have brought up, is that even in places like Thailand, the MAP project, which is incredible and doing community-based authentic restoration, started with the easiest low-lying fruit. So the Rhizophora apiculata, or the most common red mangrove, and that's because it was easy to find the propagules, it grows like weeds, and it's the most common in the areas that are lower lying intertidal areas that haven't been cut down by the villagers and the communities adjacent. The ones that have been, in the case of the Roots to Reefs project, which is what we're uncovering or unraveling right now, is that they've cut the ones nearest to the landward side, which is where their road is. That makes the most sense, and next to their fishing boats. And so unfortunately, the only propagules, or the main propagules we're getting, are these 3 species of Rhizophora. Rhizophora apiculata, Rhizophora stylosa, and Rhizophora mucronata. And there's one other Rhizophora species, but those are the 3 that we get here in the Roots to Reefs project in Indonesia, as well as Singapore. So yes, those Rhizophora species are seen all over the world. In fact, many of the mangrove species are cosmopolitan and are found all over the world. So great question, thanks.
And actually, I should have mentioned in the question, it was specifically asked about the Rhizophora mango species.
Oh, mango, yeah. And that one as well, yes. And that we have not found yet in this project area, but absolutely in the US. These are all cosmopolitan.
Yeah, it's cosmopolitan, okay.
Yeah, okay. So they're all over the planet, and they're planted most frequently because they're the easiest to grow. And in Florida, where my colleagues work, and I used to work many years ago, there are only a few species of mangrove trees, but I found 12 dominant or abundant mangrove tree species just in this small 50-hectare acre that we're restoring, and there are 30 to 50 species in the rest of Indonesia, and place even in Singapore. They're really abundant and diverse. And that's one of the fun reasons for working in, and interesting reasons for working in Southeast Asia, is because we have such a high diversity of not only the tree species, but mangrove ecosystems include shrubs, vines, herbaceous species, epiphytes, all of those. And they're not just these Rhizophora mangle or other red mangrove species that are found right along the water, but if they're large areas, so 20%, for instance, of mangrove area is found in Indonesia. Globally, 20% is found in Indonesia, where we're working. And so in these really, really large areas that I was showing some of the most pristine model ecosystems in Malaysia and Indonesia, they have a huge diversity of species and 3 different zones that you will find. So yeah, this is just a really cosmopolitan species, and that's the reason it's planted. It's easy to find and grow. I hope that answers.
Wonderful, thank you, that was perfect. And actually, if you'd like to stop sharing your slide, I think it would be great for people to see you for the end of the presentation. Yeah, that's great. The next question is if you can offer any practical ways on how to curb overfishing, especially in a country like the person who asked this question, who lives in the Philippines, where fishing is one of the main livelihoods. And you did talk a little bit about some of this, but I'm wondering if you have any further comments. She asks, would educating fishermen in the community be enough, or should there be local government involved to implement? What are your thoughts?
This is a huge topic, but I just want to focus on one phrase, and that's sustainable livelihoods. Until we find the local community's sustainable livelihoods, they're going to continue doing the type of fishing and maybe even overfishing. And sadly, that's all related to commercial fishing. As some of you on this call know, and have probably seen Seaspiracy, which is not my favorite movie, but it brings up some interesting points. Some of these local communities in Madagascar and Southeast Asia and the Philippines are seeing lower and lower abundance of certain types of fish where they're fishing in the open ocean. And it's also due to big corporate fishing as well. So we can't forget about that. And I'm not sure what to do about that. I don't think anyone knows. And I'm not going to even go there. But what we can do, and what has affected the fish, is cutting down the mangrove ecosystems. And so that's what I'm proposing here, is that if we can find a sustainable livelihood, like funding them to collect propagules, build a nursery, take care of the nursery, and plant mangrove trees, and the whole develop a resilient ecosystem, that's going to increase the potential for that to become a nursery for the fish, which will then spill over into the seagrass beds and the coral reefs. And like I said at the end of my talk, SOURCE is also doing a lot of work, and that's where they started, because Cara and her colleagues are marine biologists in coral reef restoration. I'm proposing mangrove restoration, and I proposed that to her in 2019. It's more fundable. It's easier for the communities to get involved in, even the fishermen. And they're doing all this outreach, like the woman from the listener, sorry, I don't know if it's male from the Philippines, was talking about, like getting the fishermen involved, getting the women's groups involved, getting the youth, the schools involved. And that is what SOURCE is doing. That's why this is such a fantastic example, even during the pandemic. And when I say sustainable livelihoods, that every resort around them stopped paying their workers as soon as they lost the tourists. Okay, SOURCE was committed, even though they were losing money, to continuing to pay for their staff. And they've even accepted 20 interns, ecotourist interns from the government program, working with the government and paying them, because there's nowhere else to go at SOURCE. And so they're all now wrapped around this amazing Roots to Reefs project and planting mangrove trees through the Tree app and the CrowdRise And the real reason for the crowd rise is to pay for the community to help, but there has to be an infrastructure too for source. And the landlord actually said, hey, we need some more money in the pandemic, so you need to give us $20,000 US. And so they're kind of freaking out, because if they leave, then all the sustainable income for these communities leaves. And so it's really a complex problem, and the simple answer is developing more sustainable livelihoods through whatever novel, innovative way we can. And so that's why we're brainstorming these new ideas for funding sources. So fantastic question. It's about education, and I'm an educator. That's why I'm an educator. I was a practitioner for 20 years doing restoration, but now I do both and I integrate them, because I know that we cannot do significant, resilient ecosystem restoration like the UN wants us to in the next 10 years if we don't involve communities.
Right, that's such a common theme in conservation efforts, that conservation is local, and you really have to lean into and understand the needs of the community and solve for those needs in order to make conservation possible. So yeah, it's amazing what Source is doing.
So
Right.
You start local, so you start grassroots and local, and then you scale up instead of being the Nature Conservancy. And Nature Conservancy does wonderful projects, but they start from the top down. And so how can we all work together to maybe start the model from the grassroots approach, from the communities and what they need and want, and then work to a larger ecosystem landscape restoration?
Sounds awesome. Okay, we have a couple other questions. One question is about the National Marine Park, Gita National Marine Park. If you would be able to share any information about how that came about. How was it created? When was it created? How did it happen politically? And was there civil society support? Do you know anything about the history?
You know, that was the one thing I didn't have time to refresh myself on. I can talk a little bit to that. Cara Majerus, if she was on right now, she could talk a lot about that because she lives there. So I'll just do the best I can answering the question, and fantastic question. I had one of my graduate students, master's students, actually lives in Java in Indonesia, and that's her specialty. She works with the government and the Indonesian government, and all the documents, this is why I don't really know, all the documents are written in their language, in Bahasa Indonesian. And so she was able to read through these marine protected area documents. There's actually even a law now to protect mangrove ecosystems that started in the 90s nationally and then became more localized in Lombok, I think in 2011, 2012, something like that. Don't quote me on that, but more recently. So what I did with Cara is I said, okay, after my student researched the Gita Nada National Marine Protected Area and the mangrove protection laws, we went to Google Earth, and we used the go back in time little button, and we went back to as far back as we could, which was 1984 in Southeast Asia. And that was kind of blurry, but we could see that there was very, very few mangroves. They had really, this whole area that we're working in had been pretty devastated because they use it for building materials. Because mangroves grow in standing water, they have to, like all other trees that grow in wetlands, they have to protect themselves. So they're trade-offs. And the trade-off to growing taller or more, maybe having showier flowers and attracting pollinators, is to actually survive in these inhospitable conditions. And so what they do is they protect themselves, and in turn, their wood becomes very ideal wood for building materials because it becomes rot resistant and termite resistant. And so it's this great material, waterproof for boats and houses and whatnot. And so they were all cut down back then. And then as we go further in time, we looked at when the Mangrove Protection Act started, and that showed that fewer and fewer trees were being cut and they were starting to regenerate. Now, those were the red mangrove trees mostly when you go out in the field and look, because that was the predominant abundance of propagulls that were floating in and colonizing, or volunteering is what we call them. And so that was starting to restore itself. And so a lot of people will ask, well, why do we have to then help it to be restored? And that's because we simply don't have the abundance of trees that were actually cut down in the landward side. And that's where a lot of the diversity lies. And so that's what SOURCE is really focusing on. And now, connected to the question, we kept going back in time. So that was really neat to see the impact of the mangrove law that was enacted. And so I'll still just finish on the mangroves here, just by saying there's no enforcement. Okay, there's no enforcement, especially in the pandemic. So that is why SOURCE is working with the local communities to educate them on the importance of the mangroves. Once they know about the importance, they're not going to cut them down. And so there's very little cutting. They've seen 2 trees in 2 years cut down. That's it, out of thousands of trees. And so it's really working by connecting in a meaningful way with the communities. And so then in a larger scale, the question was asked about the newly created Gita Nada Marine Park, is what they call it in Indonesia and Singapore. They call them parks, and they have different levels of protection, just like in our California MPAs, and the Farallon Islands and all the different national marine protected areas off the coast of California as well. They have different zones and different activities that are allowed depending on the sensitivity of the ecosystems and where they're located. So exact same model. And the mangroves are protected in a couple of different areas, including this one. We just need to now enforce that protection. How did it come about? I don't know. I'm so sorry. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm pretty sure it was a government pressure by other countries, and then by international organizations and efforts. Ana Blanca, one of her, the International Ocean Film Festivals, I'm forgetting her name right now, but one of her board members actually used to work in connecting all the Southeast Asian communities together and coming up with policy on a larger scale. The problem with protected areas is that boats can come in from international waters, from Philippines, from Korea, from Japan, wherever, and they're doing the illegal poaching right now, mostly. The locals are just doing sustenance fishing. Okay, so there also are now, not a lot, but there were, at least before the pandemic, boats supported by the government for this marine park, that were going out and actually monitoring and making sure there was no international vessels coming in and doing the poaching. But it's happening right, left, and center right now, especially in the deeper waters where they can get larger sharks and rays. And that's what the director of SOURCE is doing her PhD on endangered species poaching. So it's a good place to be right now, I guess, for that sad topic. But yeah, I'm not saying it's very effective right now because of all of what I just mentioned, but it's a great start for Indonesia to have these marine protected areas. What we found in our research with, I work with shark stewards, and what they found, and I've been part of, is that if you also start grassroots and look at locally protected marine areas and working from the bottom up again to protect areas instead of coming from a bottom or top-down approach, it's much more effective. And there are organizations like Shark Stewards that have been working in Timor-Leste and the Coral Triangle trying to facilitate those locally managed marine protected areas. Well, we're doing something kind of a hybrid. Everyone knows the word hybrid now, hybrid learning. Well, we're doing a hybrid of, well, they put lines on a map. Now let's engage the local governments, the local communities, their local NGOs that are trying to do good but don't really know how to do it. So let's work with them hand in hand. I'm not going to say train, but work with them hand in hand to get them to understand how to do restoration of mangroves and coral reefs And they're doing both. And they're well funded by the government. And so it's really important for all the stakeholders to work together collectively to protect places like the Gita Nada Marine Park, locally managed marine parks, and even the areas of mangrove that aren't protected by that larger marine park. And there are quite a few. So we're trying to get the local communities to develop these. Great question. And actually in the chat before we finish, or if there's a way for you to get information to them, my graduate students, PhD and graduate students, and written by a really amazing writer, so it's really easy to read, the Roots to Reefs project report. And so there's even parts about how to get women's groups involved, gender equality, and sustainable handicrafts that they can make to make a living. So it really touches on not just marine park policy and all the way from ocean to mangroves and how to do the community-based restoration, but all these other parts are components of building resilient communities and ecosystems.
Awesome. Is that something that you might know the URL for, or have a copy of it you want to upload? You were saying
I don't have a URL. I didn't post it. I need to ask my students, I guess, but I can. Okay. I have a YouTube channel, but I don't.
Okay.
I should post it actually. You're right, on my ResearchGate site so everyone can access it. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be amazing.
I'll just post it in the chat. Yeah, it's really, there's lots of great maps and pictures, but if you're specifically interested in the policy, it's all there. It was all translated and written and edited. So it's, 5 or 6 pages. Yeah.
Fantastic. We do have a couple more questions. First of all, the restoration plantings look quite dense. Why is that? Why are they dense?
Okay, what photograph are you mentioning? Because I've shown model what we call reference sites behind me, or are you talking about the landscape planting? There is one that was a landscape planting. We didn't do that. We haven't started planting yet. So none of the planting photographs are ours. And okay. The reason that I think that's the one that they're talking about. The reason that one was planted so close, that's like just typical standard plant in rows in any wetland ecosystem. That's what we've been doing with the Nature Conservancy for years. And we're now, plant one species in rows close together. And that was the beginning 30 years ago. And we've evolved to now planting many species a little bit further apart and with communities, right? I mean, we just evolved, the field evolved over time. The reason they're planted so close, my guess is because, in rows, it's because maintenance and just ease of planting. If you're planting with community members or people that don't really know, and it's really hard to walk in the mucky quicksand-like soils. But number two, there are so many planted because some of them will die. Okay, and so I take the approach of planting fewer and a more random planting approach, and obviously not just one species, but that's why we have flags on ours, planting in multiple. We have 8 species now planting, but planting those in the right zone, not just all over the ecosystem in these huge monocultures. So yeah, we've evolved a lot, and we're integrating what we've learned over the years from other mangrove restoration projects, but that wasn't ours. It was just an example of large scale mangrove planting in Southeast Asia.
Okay, great. And then another question about, as you're working with communities to try to help them transition to more sustainable livelihoods, what has replaced fishing in those communities? And
that is the magic question, right?
Yeah.
That is what everyone wants to know, because that's the part that I didn't mention. Great question, and thank you so much for bringing that up. So in some places like Thailand, that's developing a little bit faster than at least Lombok is. Other parts of Indonesia have developed as fast, but they've gone to aquaculture, and the literature and NGOs will talk about, oh, we should go to aquaculture. It's so much more sustainable. Well, it can be if it's a really, really small local scale. right? And it's been used for years in the tropics in Hawaii in the US, right? By the local indigenous peoples, right? But in a sustainable way, not on the massive scale that I showed. And I'm gonna I'm not a proponent of aquaculture, at least in that it cuts down mangrove ecosystems and not on a massive scale. That is not going to replace the fishing. And it brings up a lot of other problems that will cause fisheries to collapse. Just simply, I'll just like name one, but simply the waste from the fish in this densely populated fish pond has to go somewhere, right? And it often leaks out in the high tides or flood events that happen all the time here into the natural ecosystems and cause harm. Many other impacts of that. So I'm not going to promote aquaculture unless it's like one small pond for the whole community. And they actually, in this community, they have a couple of ponds that are salt harvesting ponds. And in the permission process, we have given them that small area to use. And who knows, they might create one aquaculture pond out of that, but you have to, there's this balance, you have to give and take. You can't take everything from the community. You have to give them a sustainable livelihood. So the sustainable livelihood I am proposing is the restoration itself and the ecotourism and the education, everything around that. However, they still need to eat, right? And so they have rice paddies around the village so they can get a source of rice, which they have to eat at every meal or they freak out. It's pretty amazing. It's even more important than our bread in the US, but fish too. And if they can fish only for what they need on a line, and we have healthy mangrove ecosystems, as long as they don't become a Singapore in Lombok, have 6 million people on this tiny little island, it will be sustainable. And then I just want to end by saying nothing's sustainable if we have too many people on this planet. So it's a big challenge. Yeah, and really, points. I guess the last point is that if we can get them to fish and not in the marine protected areas, the most critical areas to protect for the organisms and the quality of the habitat, and get them to fish outside like we're doing in California. That has been shown in many publications since my PhD studies at UCLA, where my colleague was studying the effects before and after we implemented MPAs and inside and outside of MPAs. Pretty quickly, the abundance and the size and diversity of fish species comes back. So if we have that network of MPAs, we can have the locals, we can have a local sustainable fishery as long as we're not Singapore. And we're just a population of, a few thousand in the region, not a few million. Thank you for that question.
That is all of the questions that we have. Thank you so much for this fantastic presentation. We've got multiple comments about loving this presentation. It's so inspiring. Thank you so much. We are just, absolutely inspired by the work that you're doing. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Hopefully we've inspired some more people to get more involved in supporting Source and your project from Roots to Reefs.
The mangrove roots to the coral reefs, yeah.
There you go, mangrove roots to coral reefs, yes. And I think what I will do is I'll make sure that when we publish the video of this presentation in our newsletter, I'll make sure to include those URL links that you provided at the end of the deck so that everyone will have easy access to them.
I'm posting the report, the Roots to Reefs report and restoration plan in the chat right now before everyone leaves. Just give me one.
Yeah, Gretchen, you might want to just shoot us an email of those links, because that might make it even easier for Gail. We'll
yeah, that would be fabulous.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway, your passion comes through, and your optimism that we, through the right action, we can turn this around, and but it takes action and consciousness. So, and not eating shrimp.
Yeah, right. I know. I'm sorry, but that's just the reality.
No,
It is. You're right.
have that that reminder. So, anyway,
I love shrimp too. I've loved it since I was a kid, and I didn't really like other seafood. That was my gateway, and it's sad that I can't eat it anymore. But yeah, the shrimp are coming from places like this, and that is not a sustainable livelihood. Even in Thailand, some of the shrimp ponds, they were feeding the shrimp to make them larger. They're feeding them this chemical food, and that was like actually making the pond toxic so that the shrimp couldn't even survive for more than a year. And so these are just, they're not even close to being sustainable. And I just want to give a shout out to Mangrove Action Project, who is doing amazing work in the region with communities. And they're and converting these ponds, these aquaculture ponds, to mangrove forests. We're lucky we don't have ponds to convert here. We have pretty natural hydrology and soils, and all throughout the region it hasn't been developed like that, and so it makes it easier to do more of a tree planting and community-based project without a lot of funding. But my shout out goes to them because they're doing such cool community-based work that we haven't been able to tap into yet. But the women's group has started bees. They've found native bees, and they're putting beehives up all throughout the mangroves, and they collect the honey and make honey and sell it to support their community, and all sorts of other products made out of honey. And you can't get it online because it's supposed to support, Thailand and their local communities. So there's some pretty novel approaches to these, to funding and getting communities involved. And then I just wanted to say, I didn't invite my students today, but I'll post it on my YouTube site for them, because we just did a virtual planting for 2.5 hours on Saturday to celebrate International Mangrove Ecosystem Day. But I start my thought process from my students and my teaching, although I'm a researcher and a practitioner of mangrove restoration. And my teaching practice and philosophy is based around discovery and exploration. And I think if we can get everyone to places like this, they can become intrigued by mangroves by kayaking as ecotourists. And that's the gateway to wanting to help preserve these areas, support communities, and help with the restoration. And then, go to source, and you can go diving too, and you can help with the coral reef restoration, which is much harder. But let's start with mangroves, where it's a little bit easier to connect. And yeah, so I do, my whole ethos is about getting active in the community, doing active learning and restoration, and trying to get my students engaged and inspired to do that. So I hope I've inspired your group today, even though I didn't talk a lot about cetaceans. I talked about their habitat.
It's all connected. It's all connected. We need healthy ocean ecosystems to have healthy cetaceans. So yes, it's
and
important.
I can't wait to see dugong. They're around, but they're very elusive in our mangroves here.
Well, we wish that in your near future. And thanks again, Gretchen. It's great to see you. And yeah, we'll stay in touch.
Thanks again, both Gail and Susan. Great to see you again, Gail, and hope to swim in the San Francisco Bay with you in December.
Thank you, Gretchen.
Thank you all. Thanks so much.